So we can put it as some 8 to 10 important aspects that were primarily there in the budget. So this budget can be seen as something like a long-term budget. It is a very stable budget which is looking at long-term stability and resilience. One of the most important aspects in this budget, we call it as the Yuva Shakti driven budget, where we have three important kartavya. Why MSMEs have to be supported and what are the main problems of MSME? So government has reduced the basic customs duty on important areas. Hello friends, this is Ram Sudhir. Currently we are trying to have a snapshot of the budget. So why am I calling it as a snapshot? We'll look into the most important areas in the budget. So we can put it as some 8 to 10 important aspects that were primarily there in the budget. So before we start on to discuss about the budget, one important message from the economic survey. Let's try to see what is this message. Okay, so this message sets the mindset for the survey as well as the budget, and this also helps us understand the mindset of the government. So this budget can be seen as something like a long-term budget, and there is no desperation with respect to the policies. It is a very stable budget which is looking at long-term stability and resilience. That can be understood from this particular aspect here, which continues in the budget as well. For example, let's say here you can see Yama's message in Katha Upanishad, which talks about two types of minds here. Okay, so here basically it is very clear indication that the country stands to gain immensely when all of us embrace delayed gratification. So what is this delayed gratification? So delayed gratification is something like, I'm not going ahead with deep cuts. I will not motivate FPIs to anyhow come into India by giving capital gains tax cuts, but rather we are more focused on long-term benefit of the country. So this is what is a clear objective which is clearly mentioned here. And it also talks about the global environment. The global environment is being reshaped by geopolitical realignments that will influence investment supply chains. So there's huge amount of turmoil outside right now. So when it comes to supply chain disruptions, trade wars, and many other problems, and at that point of time, a mature mind thinks long term and is going to be more stable. This is what is something which we observe, because this is the mindset of the psychology of the government when it has come up with the budget this year. So this is not a budget where you want to appease people. It is not a populist budget. This is how they were trying to mention also. We'll try to understand here. So one of the most important aspects in this budget, we call it as the Yuva Shakti driven budget, where we have three important kartavya. So what are these three important kartavya? One, accelerate and sustain economic growth. Why? Unless and until there is growth, there is no job creation. And unless there are jobs, you cannot reap the benefit of Yuva Shakti, that is the young population. So young population has to be taken in. And this demographic dividend, if it should not become demographic disaster, most important aspect is employment, skill development, productivity, and competitiveness. That is clearly mentioned in the first kartavya here, that is accelerate and sustain economic growth. Okay, and the second kartavya which we see here, fulfill aspirations of people. So build people's capacity, make them strong partners in India's path to prosperity. So it is talking about some inclusive participation of people in the growth story of the country. Now it is basically we need people with proper skills, education, health, etc. to contribute to the nation building and also to build trust in the India's growth story. That is very clear. So one of our important strengths is the demography which we have, the young demography which we have, and we have to reap the dividend from that demography right away. This is something which has to be done immediately. Then the third kartavya, vision of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. Now this is basically, all these developments are not for one community. These are independent of region, religion, and it is for everybody. And this is opportunities for meaningful participation for everybody. Ensure that every family, community, region, and sector has access to resources, amenities, and opportunities. So that is very important here. So the whole budget line itself is based on these three kartavya to focus on poor, underprivileged, and disadvantaged. So now moving forward, here the budget speech started off discussing, most importantly, Viksit Bharat, balancing ambition with inclusion. So the government is giving more priority to action over ambivalence and people over populism. We are here to implement policies. So we are going to implement policies as effectively as possible. That means government is again talking about giving a very strong message that policy implementation will be very, very efficient this year. And we are going to set a path for Viksit Bharat. And this budget is not going to be populist budget. People are important. People over populism, reforms over rhetoric, and action over ambivalence. Now, this is government in action, basically. So the policies are going to be implemented at a faster pace, and you can't expect much of populists. So this kind of attitude comes when you know that you are politically stable. So this is basically a politically stable budget, which is thinking for the long term. So here we can see high growth rate. Of course, economic survey was talking about a growth rate of 6.8 to 7.2. So on an average, we are talking about around 7% growth. So when the whole globe is not doing well, a 7% growth is a fantastic growth. So here we observe few things here. One, government is talking about energy security, structural reforms, fiscal prudence, monetary stimulus, citizens benefits from government actions, domestic manufacturing facility, and strong public investment. So government is also very clear on public investment. For example, when we look at 12.2 lakh crore of capital expenditure, so government is very clear that investment will be our focus in this budget. Moving forward here, now fiscal prudence is very clearly visible as far as this budget is concerned. How do we get to know that fiscal prudence is very clear? For example, when we look at the deficits here, one, the fiscal deficit. So the budget target is around 4.3% of GDP. So 4.3% of GDP at this turbulent moment is definitely a fantastic move. So we can observe after the COVID period that the deficits have come down to a great extent. So one more important observation is when we look at the primary deficits of the government also. So 0.7% of GDP, that is primary deficit. So when we look at FD at 4.3, PD at 0.7%, and RD at 1.5%. So these are very decent numbers, and that too in turbulent moments. So government is very clear. So government says on one side economic growth, on the other side our inflation is less, and still there is fiscal prudence. And in spite of all this, we are not rewarded with the currency value stability or capital flows. And government did not motivate the foreign investors through tax deductions so that immediately the capital inflows will directly come. So that means government is looking at somebody who will love India's growth story and invest long-term in India rather than any short-term twists or short-term benefits. So this is something which we see in the budget, that is something like the fiscal prudence. And now when we look at certain receipts here and expenditures, what does this indicate? For example, when we look at capital receipts here, somewhere around 18 lakh crore. Of course, there is a borrowing of around 17.2 lakh crore, which looks a little high. But at the same time, government is very clear that we are going to borrow and spend, and primarily our focus will be on public investment. Okay, so here, revenue receipts, when we look at around 35 lakh crore, revenue expenditures around 41. And then we have the effective capital expenditures, which is around 17 lakh crore. So effective capital expenditure numbers, when we look at it, looks pretty decent. It includes the capital expenditure of the government, that is around 12.2 lakh crore, plus the grants given by the center to states for capital purpose. So this clearly shows around 53 lakh crore budget, in which 17 lakh crore government is going to arrange through borrowings. Of course, this was also one of the reason for the expectation of the bond yields to go up next year, because it's an indication that government is going to borrow more the subsequent year. Okay, so here when we look at effective capital expenditure at 17 lakh crore, and why government had to borrow? Obviously, government has to borrow because government had to spend more on capital expenditure. So we should understand that 12.2 lakh crore of capital expenditure is almost there, and government has announced, and that too at this point of time. This shows that government is very clear on public investment. Another important aspect here is government's focus on semiconductors. So as it is, we know, so earlier it is all about food security. Today it is technology and technology transfer. And very few countries, we know it is all about US or Taiwan and China, which completely control the supply chains of the semiconductor segment. So government in this budget is very clear that we are going to think long term, especially with respect to the semiconductor. So building on the initial success of the semiconductor mission, the government is launching this. So it focused on sector capabilities. This targets the production of equipment and materials, a design of full stack Indian IP, the fortification of supply chain. So here basically government is directly focusing on strengthening our supply chains, especially with respect to semiconductors. Another important element which is very much linked to semiconductors as well is the critical minerals and rare earths, where China is a leader. So India wants to become Atmanirbhar. India has to build these technologies. So there is no other option. So there's a direct focus on semiconductors and critical minerals. So when we look at critical minerals, rare earth corridors here, so this will be provided to the mineral rich states like Odisha, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu to establish dedicated corridors for mining, processing, research and manufacturing. So this is basically another important area in the budget where government is focusing on. Now, so in the last year budget also, there was this aspect of deregulation that was focused. And even this year, there was this discussion about deregulation and inclusive growth. So when we talk about inclusive growth, MSMEs play a very important role. So what is this? Why MSMEs have to be supported? And what are the main problems of MSME? So one of the most important problems of MSME is the cash crunch for the MSMEs. The cash flows do not easily come into MSMEs. So how do we handle this problem? So government was looking into this, and government has come up with a liquidity support system for MSME, that is the TREDS platform, Trade Receivables Discounting System platform. So what is the benefit of TREDS? So TREDS, how will TREDS help MSME? So in the budget, they said all public sector enterprises purchases from MSME to be settled via this TREDS platform. So this is very important because MSMEs can take loans on their invoices that are generated. Now, and these invoices can also be basically backed by credit guarantee support. That means keeping MSMEs invoices, discounting MSME invoices for any financial entity becomes difficult. Why? Because there is always a scope or a risk of default. But if these receipts are not discounted, then cash flows might take for a very long time for MSME. So what does this discounting system do for MSME? The financial entity in this platform will discount the bills of MSME, and MSMEs will be getting easy loan or credit. But at the same time, security has to be provided to the financer who is helping the MSME. So this security is provided through the credit guarantee support. This is what it is. So what is the new change which we see in the budget? One, all public sector enterprises which purchase from MSME, it has to be settled via the TREDS platform. And this sets a benchmark for all other corporates. That means the central public sector enterprises are going to settle things for the MSME. They are going to participate in this particular platform. Credit guarantee support to provide guarantees for invoice discounting on TREDS, reducing lender risk. So lender risk is there. So lender risk is handled by this guarantee support that is given. Okay. So when we look at this aspect here, introduction of trades receivables as asset-backed securities to boost liquidity. That means these receivables can be used as an asset-backed security for taking loans to boost liquidity. So these are some of the important measures. Why there is a focus on MSME? So we should understand that MSMEs contribute to almost like 45% of our exports. 60% of MSMEs have a rural base, and almost like 20% of MSMEs have women owners. So we talk about tribal development, social equity, employment generation. So MSME's role is directly linked to inclusive growth. And one of the biggest problem of MSMEs is the liquidity support. And this liquidity support is going to be enhanced further in this trades platform. This is what is discussed in the budget. So there are some changes which we look at, important things which we will see here with respect to the direct taxes. So one important change is with respect to this tax called minimum alternate tax. So MAT tax has been reduced from 15% to 14%. But at the same time, what we should understand is MAT is seen as a final tax from April 1st onwards. That means we will not have any kind of credit, MAT credits to be carry forwarded for the subsequent years. So this is one of the important aspect here. So what is this? What does that mean? For example, let's say this year, corporate tax to be paid is 10 lakhs and MAT to be paid is 12 lakhs. Okay. So there is a 2 lakh of MAT credit which is to be carry forwarded to the next year. This 2 lakhs of the credit is to be carry forwarded to the next year. Okay. Now subsequent year, suppose if the corporate tax is more than the MAT, let's say corporate tax is 14 lakh and MAT is 13 lakh. Okay. So already there is 2 lakh credit which is already there. Okay. So this 2 lakh credit which is already there, from that 2 lakh, that difference of 1 lakh which is there. So in the next year I said 14 lakh is the corporate tax, 13 lakhs is MAT. So there is a difference of 1 lakh. That means my corporate tax is more by 1 lakh. So from this MAT credit of 2 lakh, 1 lakh will be utilized in that year. So the remaining 1 lakh can be carry forwarded to the next year. This can be done for 15 assessment years. So what government is saying with respect to MAT is, from April 1st, 2026, though the MAT rate has been reduced now for the next year, you cannot carry forward these MAT credits. This is what the government is talking about with respect to MAT. MAT will be treated as a final tax. So there is no credit accumulation after April 1st, 2026. Okay. One more important change is related to the share buyback. So what is a share buyback? Whenever the company is buying back the share, okay, so the shareholder earlier, whatever gain he used to get was basically treated like the dividend income. So what they used to do, in whichever tax bracket you fall, you will be taxed accordingly. For example, you fall in the 30% slab, then your returns as a shareholder would be taxed at 30%. But now what government has done with respect to share buyback? Now share buyback, when the companies do a buyback of shares, why will companies do buybacks? There are many reasons for share buybacks. When the companies do a share buyback, you are gaining some money because you purchased the share at a certain price. Now the company has bought back this share from you at a higher price. Let's say 1 lakh rupees is the price at which you have purchased the share. Now company has purchased it back from you at 2 lakhs. So you have got a gain of 1 lakh here. On that 1 lakh now, you will be paying only capital gains tax. For example, if you are holding it, if your share has been held for a long-term period, okay, the share has been held for a long-term period, you end up paying only 12.5 instead of paying 30%. This is the benefit for the shareholder which they were talking about when it comes to share buybacks. So this was one important aspect which we should understand. Another important entity which we observe here is the liberalized the tax collected at source reduction. So here one important observation is this TCS, which is tax collected at source, as far as our LRS scheme is concerned. So LRS is what? Liberalized remittances scheme. Suppose I want to send money outside India. So there's dollars I want to send outside. Why should I send money outside? Maybe for education, or maybe for a foreign trip, maybe for some operation, healthcare, or I want to buy some shares outside. So under such circumstances, LRS rules are applicable because foreign currency is being pushed from India to outside world. Okay, so under LRS, the TCS that used to be there was 5% earlier, and it has been reduced to 2%. Now, we have to understand that this reduction is not for all the purposes. It is only for education and medical purposes only. This is one more important observation as far as the TCS reduction is concerned. So this tax related to LRS is only reduced for two entities, that is education and medical purposes. Under the liberalized remittances scheme is reduced from 5% to 2%. It is not for other purposes. It is only for these two purposes. So there's not huge difference, but yes, for education and healthcare, there is a reduction from 5% to 2%. Okay. One more important thing which was done. So everybody thought that the government would reduce the taxes, capital gains tax or STT or all these taxes to pull back portfolio investors. But the mindset of the government I've explained in the initial slide, it is very clear. Government is looking ahead at long-term stability than short-term gains. This was also reflected in the increase in the STT taxes. Securities transaction tax was increased by almost 150% on futures, from 0.02% to 0.05%. Now, this clearly shows that government wants to discourage speculation and government wants to encourage long-term investors. So, the government message is very clear. Government wants to protect the small income players who are losing out money in the share market due to gambling. As simple as that. Okay. Then, another important observation here, an important change with sovereign gold bonds. So earlier sovereign gold bonds, what was the purpose of sovereign gold bond? The purpose of sovereign gold bond is to channelize money into the market, or government wants to discourage people from holding physical gold. And that is the reason sovereign gold bonds were launched. So sovereign gold bonds have regular interest to be paid. And it is safe also, but it is backed by government. So therefore it is safe. So and therefore sovereign gold bonds were a big hit. Now what is the main change which government has brought in now? And why? So government is saying, if you have purchased the sovereign gold bond from RBI earlier, okay, from RBI earlier, you need not pay capital gains tax. So earlier also there was no capital gains tax. The benefit of sovereign gold bond is you get interest, it is backed by government, safety, then you need not pay capital gains tax on the gain you get. These are the benefits of sovereign gold bond. But what is the change they have brought in the budget? They said two categories of people are there, let's say. One person has purchased the sovereign gold bond directly from RBI. Now this person, when the bond matures after 10 years, he would have got a gain. On that gain, he need not pay any capital gains tax. But this person B, who would have purchased sovereign gold bond from the market, that means just purchase sovereign gold bond from the market. So when you buy it from the market, and though you hold it till maturity, on the gain you get, you have to pay capital gains tax. This is what is the new change which the government has brought in with respect to sovereign gold bonds. Okay, so sovereign gold bond, that's an important aspect which government has focused. Reason being, now we understand that again there is high demand for physical gold. And there are a lot of other problems coming up with respect to increase in the gold prices. Of course, there are good things also. Good things, about increase in gold prices, people started taking more gold loans. Gold loans are secured loans. That means more secured credit is given by banks now. That means secured credit means chance of NPA is less for the banks. That's a positive aspect. So everything has a positive, everything has a negative aspect. Accumulation of physical gold is bad. If people are taking loans to buy new gold, people are taking old gold loans on gold and buying new gold, that's again a negative. But at the same time, if they are using it for some productive purpose, then definitely yes, it is beneficial. So this is the main change with respect to the sovereign gold bond. Okay. So moving forward, there are some changes in the indirect taxes as well. Now, when we look at indirect taxes here, especially look at critical minerals, capital goods required for processing critical minerals are exempted from basic customs duty. Very important this is. So specifically the duty on monazite is reduced from 2.5% to 0. So here reforms are very clear that we want to strengthen our supply chains here. Okay, so along with solar battery storage, exemption on capital goods for manufacturing lithium ion cells is extended to include those used for battery energy storage systems. Another important observation here, nuclear power. The exemption on goods required for nuclear power projects is extended until 2035 and expanded to all plants regardless of capacity. So here, there is a direct focus on critical minerals, solar, battery storage, especially lithium, nuclear power, etc. Very clear. Another important observation here, export sectors, especially textiles, marine. These marine and seafood got affected because of Trump tariff. And here, if you see, the limit for duty-free imports of inputs used for processing seafood is increased from 1% to 3% of the previous year's export turnover. Okay, so the limit for duty-free imports of inputs used for processing seafood is increased from 1% to 3%. Another important observation here, duty-free import of inputs is extended to manufacture of shoes, that is the leather industry, etc. Okay, so this is another important aspect here. So government has reduced the basic customs duty on important areas. For example, when we look at aviation, BCD is exempted on components, engines and parts required for manufacturing aircraft. So here, and electronics also again, BCD is exempted on specified parts used in manufacturing of microwave ovens, etc. So this clearly shows government has reduced the basic customs duty on most of the important items. That is one of the important area where you talk about the custom duty exemptions and reductions here. Okay, so one is even the defense also, raw materials imported by defense PSUs for manufacturing aircraft parts, maintenance, repair are also exempted from the basic customs duty. Now these are the important aspects. So there is no much of changes with respect to our taxes or with respect to the slabs and with respect to any other main changes which everybody expected. So this budget is more like a stable budget which is looking forward for long term. So completely a long-term stable budget which wants to make India Viksit Bharat. So that is what we observe when we talk about this budget. And that's all for today. Thank you.